I had some time to kill that afternoon, so I decided to stop into a thrift store I'd passed 100 times but never really noticed before. It was one of those small, cluttered shops tucked between a laundromat and a liquor store, with dusty windows and a faded sign that just said Thrift and Treasures. I figured I'd poke around for a while, maybe find something interesting to pass the time. The moment I stepped inside, a little bell jingled above the door, announcing my presence. The place was dimly lit, with narrow aisles crammed with everything from old lamps and mismatched furniture to vintage clothes and dusty books. The air smelled faintly of mothballs and mildew, and the floor creaked underfoot as I walked. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but I liked that it felt like a treasure hunt, chaotic and full of possibilities. I wandered the aisles, running my fingers over random items, a chipped teapot here, an old typewriter there. Nothing really stood out. As I moved deeper into the store, it grew quieter, and I realized how eerily still it was. No music, no other customers, just the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Even the owner, a wiry older man with thinning hair and thick glasses, was nowhere to be seen. It felt like I was completely alone. Toward the back of the store, the shelves became even more cluttered, piled with items that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Dust hung in the air, glinting in the light from a single bulb overhead. One shelf caught my eye. It was packed with random knickknacks, porcelain figurines, tarnished silverware, old toys with peeling paint. As I sifted through them, I noticed something odd. At the very back of the shelf, partially hidden behind a stack of yellowed books, was a small wooden door. It was no bigger than a shoebox, with a tiny brass knob, and it looked completely out of place. My curiosity got the better of me. I reached in, brushing aside the books, and opened the little door. It creaked on its hinges, revealing a dark compartment inside. My heart skipped a beat as I leaned closer to get a better look. Inside were two skulls, human skulls. They were small, like they belonged to children, and their surfaces gleamed unnaturally, almost like they'd been polished. Nestled between them were vibrant gemstones in deep reds, greens, and blues, each one catching the faint light and casting colorful reflections. I froze, staring at the strange collection, my mind racing. Why were these here? Who would keep something like this hidden in a thrift store? I reached in to touch one of the gemstones, almost hypnotized by the way it shimmered. Just as my fingers grazed the edge of one, a hand clamped down on my shoulder, hard. I jumped, spinning around to see the store owner standing behind me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of anger and fear. "What are you doing back here?" he snapped, his voice low and trembling. I was just looking," I stammered, pointing at the shelf. "This door. It was open, and You shouldn't be touching that," he barked, cutting me off. His grip on my arm tightened, and before I could react, he yanked me away from the shelf. "You need to leave, now." I tried to protest, to explain that I hadn't meant any harm, but he wouldn't listen. He practically dragged me down the aisle toward the front of the store, his knuckles white as he gripped my arm. "Get out," he said through gritted teeth, shoving me toward the door. The bell jingled again as I stumbled out onto the sidewalk, the door slamming shut behind me. I stood there for a moment, stunned, my heart pounding. My arm still ached where he'd grabbed me. I turned back to the window, but the light inside the store was dim, and I couldn't see him. I could feel his gaze, though, like he was still watching me from the shadows. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The skulls, the gemstones, the way the owner had reacted, it didn't make sense. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? I found some weird stuff in a thrift store. They'd laugh me off the phone. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the scene over and over in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those skulls staring back at me, their empty sockets seeming to glow faintly in the dark. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how unnatural the whole situation had felt. Those skulls weren't just decorations, and those gemstones weren't just trinkets. There was something wrong about them, something that felt alive. The next morning, I decided to go back to the store. I had to know more. When I got there, though, the place was closed. The windows were dark, and the Thrift and Treasures sign had been taken down. It was like the store had never existed. I asked around, but no one seemed to know anything about it. One woman who worked at the laundromat next door said the shop had been vacant for years. She looked at me like I was crazy when I described the owner. "There hasn't been anyone in there since I started working here," she said, shrugging. To this day, I don't know what I stumbled upon in that thrift store. I don't know what those skulls and gemstones were, or why the owner, or whoever he was, reacted the way he did. All I know is that I'll never forget the way they looked, gleaming in the dark behind that tiny wooden door. And sometimes late at night, I can still feel the weight of his hand on my arm, like a warning not to dig too deep into things better left alone.